He was ready, exercised, and bathed by 7:45. The jeep was punctual too, driven by his old friend who had never been able to tell one district office from another. Sita was in jeans and John wore a sola hat. Just in case the heat and dust get too much? Asked Agastya, with what he hoped was a winning and disarming grin. John smiled embarrassedly. A family heirloom, actually. My grandfather wore it on his rounds. I brought it along because I was dying to wear it. Now I can look a Pukabura Sahib. They moved out on the road to Mariagar, at the end of which, on an earlier occasion, had been a blue film with a superintendent of police in a rest house into which that Tamsi had tried to squeeze an entire country. This trip promised to be equally strange, accompanying an Englishman and his Indian wife on the trail of a grandfather who had been mauled by a tiger 2 generations ago. To Agastya, the world seemed infinitely bizarre. Sita and Agastya sat in front. You sit in the front if you like, he had said to John Avery. It'll be less bumpy. No, the back's perfectly all right. I can sprawl here. And he did. It's really very nice of Mr. Shrivastov to give us a jeep for this journey, shouted Avery over the roar of the jeep's diesel engine. Agastya wished he wouldn't be so formal and shouted back, One of the reasons I'm going with you is to make this trip official. Then the jeep's logbook can read Assistant Collector under training on tour to Jompana. The noise of the jeep made sustained conversation impossible, for which Agastya was happy. He could slide down in his seat till his neck rested against its back, and without a chafing, allow his mind its restlessness. In a jeep, he would smile and argue with himself. You can do nothing about your mind or your future, not until the journey is over. In a moving jeep, he was not vexed by the onus of thought. Later in the year, he would like being a BDO for much the same reason. The job entailed long jeep journeys in which he would be at rest, watching the miles pass, village boys on a tree, a hut of a post office, the sky amber at sundown, while his mind roamed when he would dread the end of the road because then again he would no longer be free. The town looked so ugly that he wanted to laugh. He realized that if he liked Madna at all, it was because of its horrifying unpretentiousness. Its greetings from a cesspool were all in it feeling. The adults defecating modestly behind bushes, the children, lords of innocence, waving to the jeep while shitting beside the road, cows and stray dogs, even inexplicably a camel, and people burgeoning like a joyous cancer. A sense of national or social sanitation is not a virtue among us. We may take a kind of bath, but we do not mind dirtying the well or the tank or the river by whose side or in which we perform ablutions. Of course, they had all heard of Gandhi, the father of the nation, but to some, Agastya remembered with a laugh, he was the uncle. It must be confusing that Nehru's progeny were also Gandhis. The 20th century superstar, especially after the film, the Hindi version of which at least a few of these defecators had seen and enjoyed in a packed cinema house, jabbing their fingers joyously at the stars of their freedom struggle. See, there's Patel, Nehru, Nehru. And it had made them feel good to see that their great leaders, after whom they had renamed everything in sight, had got together and chatted so often. Whose birthday was a national holiday. But half these defecators were illiterate, and those who weren't would never read Gandhi, much less implement him. They wouldn't step beyond the Danic and the spice of a BDO's supposed love affair with a collector. And those who did not defecate in public and could read had been blinded and their noses clogged by their familiarity with excrement on the road. Besides, it was always much easier to deify a hero than to understand him, but these shitters would never learn unless taught. Agastya was oddly reminded of the night before and Sati saying that the Naxalites around Jompana were trying to get the tribals to think. It seemed then that to each his own outlook was inadequate. Some people were compelled to obtrude in the affairs of others, sometimes just to remind them that they too had minds. The jeep raced through the miles of paddy. The harvesting had begun. "What are all these fields?" asked Sita into his ear. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, city slicker," shouted Augustia. "That's paddy." Sita laughed. He looked at her, whirls of down on the side of her cheeks, faint crease marks on her brown throat. They had probably met at one of those English universities. Then his mind began to wander, or maybe in some English town during a race riot. Maybe John Avery wore a wig and was actually a skinhead, and she had married him because beneath the formality slumbered a master of kink. He wondered again at their presence in Madna. "Why are you smiling?" asked Sita, again into his ear. "I'll tell you when the jeep stops," he shouted. The level crossing was again down, the same disorderly row of overloaded trucks and other jeeps, the drivers smoking and cursing one another to pass the time. On the last occasion, Kumar and he had chatted while piddling. They all got off. Everyone stared at Avery. "It's your Sola hat," said Augustia. "They haven't seen an Englishman and a Sola hat together since 1947. "Yes, it is a little absurd," said Avery, took it off and put it on one of the back seats. Augustia watched with envy the driver stroll away to the bushes that bordered the fields. The presence of his companions was constraining, but it was another 45 minutes to the nearest rest house. He said, "Excuse me," and went after the driver. Avery followed him. From behind a bush, Avery laughed and said, "When in India." A few kilometers later they could see the forest, a sash of dark green on the horizon. Then they turned left at a fork. The driver pointed. "The state highway goes on to Mariagar, sir, and later joins the national highway to Madras." They entered the forest imperceptibly, a few isolated teak trees like a disorderly vanguard. But this was no virgin forest, thought Augustia. Everywhere there were symptoms of desecration, tree stumps, clumps of decaying bamboo, gaps in the trees that were sometimes small fields, too many new saplings planted by an insidious forest department, and the road itself, new and black, from which Kumar had said the engineers had made lax, an interminable cicatrice on the flesh of the forest. Villages, fields, patches of scarred forest, bridges over nalas, bus stops, squatters on the road. The jeep moved on. Augustia felt a nudge on his shoulder. Sita had fallen asleep. Her head had lolled. He looked back. Avery was asleep too, uneasy with his Sola hat as a pillow. They stopped for lunch at a rest house at an insignificant small town called Tilan. A few shops, a bus stand, a post office, another statue of a deformed Gandhi, a petrol station, vegetables being sold by the squatters on the road, curious eyes, dust. They met the Tehsildar of Jompana on the veranda of the rest house. "You'll reach Jompana by about 5, sir. You will have to make a night halt at Jompana, sir. I've made arrangements. Then you can proceed to Marihandi tomorrow morning, sir. Only 45 minutes by jeep. Lunch is ready, sir." A hand moved almost involuntarily a few inches towards the dining room. "And they have also boiled water, sir, to drink for—" With his chin and a wriggle of his eyebrows, the Tehsildar indicated Augustia's companions. They all felt too dry, tired, and dull to talk. Lunch was lavish, from chicken drowned in oil, called in officialese a revenue chicken, that the subordinates in the revenue department arranged for their superiors when they came touring, and for which they were always inadequately recompensed. To Grapes, the Tehsildar and his minions hovered around the table, beaming. "Won't you eat with us?" asked Augustia perfunctorily. "No, sir. For me only 2 meals a day. Otherwise I cannot function efficiently." "That's begging the question," murmured Augustia. They began lunch by finishing a jug of water. "I suppose this really is boiled?" asked Avery, after downing 2 glasses. Augustia laughed. "Not to your desire, I think. You should have brought along with you an Indian stomach." Neither of them laughed. They ate little, and Augustia gorged, for not everyone in the district cooked like Vasant. Immediately after lunch, the Tehsildar suggested tea. "No," said Augustia firmly. "But it is ready, sir." "Okay," said Augustia. They sat in the veranda for tea, looking at the world through green lattice-work. The Tehsildar drank from the saucer. Avery and Sita refused tea vehemently and instead looked ill. "We should start immediately, I think," said Augustia. His companions looked dead to all suggestion. The Tehsildar wanted them to sleep. "The rooms are all ready, sir." Augustia called the driver. "Should we start right away?" He nodded. "Better to start now, sir. Then we can get to Jompana while it is still light." Augustia turned to the Tehsildar. "Thank you. How much for the lunch?" Eyes and mouth round in protest. They fought for a while. Avery got up to join them. They moved to the jeep after they had pushed a 50-rupee note into the Tehsildar's shirt pocket among the spectacle case and pens. "Rather nice of the Tehsildar to be like that about the lunch," said Sita as she got into the jeep. Augustia smiled cynically. "Well, if we hadn't paid, then in a few days they would be saying, 'Sen is like all the other officers, never pays.' Most officers pay, of course, but never fully." "I don't follow," said Avery. "Setting up that lunch wouldn't have cost less than 100 rupees, said Augustia. "We paid 50. The Tehsildar didn't spend anything, of course. There are too many small-time businessmen in his jurisdiction, only too happy to spend some money on his behalf. Owners of small rice mills, petrol pumps, that sort of thing. Everyone is happy with this arrangement." They looked a little awed and surprised at Augustia's knowledge of the world. So did Augustia. Then they were silenced by the starting of the jeep. They half dozed through a similar landscape to Jompana, but Augustia noticed that the forests were gradually growing thicker. They reached after 5, lulled by the jeep into a languor that clutched their bones. Violent green weeds hemming the drains, shacks, the chaos of the weekly bazaar, tribals in clothes of many colors, bicycles, merchandise on the road, grains, sugarcane, raw tobacco, trinkets for the women, bubbles for the child, cloth. Augustia inhaled the whiff of hashish. They chugged slowly through the bazaar, 3 double-storied buildings, 1 video shop. Jompana wasn't a town, but a large village with a population of about 12,000, half of whom were tribals. The rest house was new, built with other offices, on the immensity of red sand on the edge of town. Red sand till the forest on the horizon. Its awesome monotony merely accentuated by the buildings, roads, the bushes, and trees. Government had come to Jompana but recently. 3 years ago it had merely been one unremembered outpost of the district of Madna. "God, what an ugly rest house!" exclaimed Sita. It was bright pink and green, the shades of a cheap pastry with white iron grills, a psychedelic cage, gleaming new, with none of the compensatory dignity of age. A welcome party on the veranda, and a few idlers who had gathered to see an Englishman. "Myself," mumbled name, "sir. I am BDO of Jompana." "Yes, sir. I shall hand over charge to you when you come for your training." This is mumbled name, sir. The Sabati here. And that is the Revenue Circle Inspector who will be with you at Marihandi tomorrow. Tea, sir? The rooms were as usual furnished like houses. The bathrooms had tiles and taps, but no tap water. We're ready for water connection when it comes, sir, explained the caretaker, a thin, voluble man in khaki shorts. Till then, we use the well. You're also the cook? We're all vegetarians, you know. You know that, no? Vegetarians? Even that? He jerked his eyeballs towards the next room. He most of all, said Augustia, welcoming a familiar feeling. He was a Christian once, bloody beef eater, but he fell in love with India the moment he arrived and converted to Jainism. A Digambar too. In England he roams around naked. The caretaker looked suitably skeptical. Tea on the veranda. Avery and Sita didn't emerge for a while. The Sabati looked like a politician who might have taken his doubts to Krishna in a Sati cartoon, fat in white dhoti and kurta, fat mustache hiding his upper lip, eyes old with petty intrigue. Later Bajaj was to warn Agastya about this president of the local political body. Watch out for him, Bajaj would say. He has Jompana in his grasp. He is almost single-handedly responsible for the absence of tribal development in the bloc. A clean orange sun in a fading sky. Below it a beautiful one-story building in grey stone, incomprehensibly long, contrasting almost vulgarly with the rest of Jompana. What is that? Asked Agastya. The new hospital, sir, said the BDO, built by the Dutch last year. Agastya wanted to laugh. You're going to Marihandi tomorrow, Sensab, to see where that Mr. Avery was killed by a tiger? The Sabati spoke English, slowly but fluently. Yes, but there are no tigers there now. A tiger was last seen in this area about 12 years ago. We haven't come here for shikar, smiled Agastya, just to see the place. This Mr. Avery traveled 8,000 kilometers just to see Marihandi? Asked the Sabati. Agastya wanted to laugh again, absurdity after absurdity. They finished their tea and put down the saucers. The Sabati asked, When are you coming to join us, Sensab? Soon. I'm not quite sure of the exact date. They got up. The BDO said, We'll meet again tomorrow, sir. Now we'll take your leave, sir. And did. Agastya was amused, among innumerable things, by officialese. No officer ever left. He always took his leave. None of them ever stayed a night somewhere. They always made night halts. Perhaps leave was actually a euphemism for arsehole, thought his irrepressible imagination. We shall make a night halt, sir, and there I shall take your leave, sir. He laughed loudly, making the idlers look up. He was again assailed by that sense of the unreal. Now, what was he doing here in the obscurity of a place called Jompana, on the veranda of an incredible rest house with a hospital out of Holland on his right? And ahead of him a few idlers of a large village relaxing on red sand under a banyan tree, waiting to see an Englishman. And tomorrow, with the Englishman, he would travel even further into the remote, only to see a clearing in some clump of trees, just because more than 50 years ago, at that spot, a tiger had got to a man before the man could get him. And soon the Englishman and his Indian wife would appear beside him for 4 hours of kill-time conversation. And all the while the world would have continued to swirl in its uncaring way. 18 train hours away. No, more. This was not Madna. From Jompana it would be 26. In Delhi, his uncle would be setting out for his evening stroll, and Drupo and Madan would be 2 of thousands homeward bound from their offices, in clothes that irked their skins, and 22 hours away but to the northeast, In Calcutta, his father would have finished another slow ceremonial day, and was perhaps at this moment strolling on the lawn, wondering about his son, and Neera would be out on a beat, or drowning her nth tea in a crowded cafe with her journalist friends. The sun slipped into the forest. Dots of light began to appear in the blackness beneath the gray blue. The sugar-cane stalls beyond the rest house gate switched on all the lamps on their rickety tables, and the lights from the naked bulbs were transformed by the carved earthen shades, the handiwork of exploited tribal potters. Ethnic Drupa would have dubbed these shades with a delectable sneer. The idlers melted away. From the veranda the stalls looked beautiful, even romantic, like a terraced restaurant in one of Delhi's new hotels, which would have a fancy Indian name murderously pronounced by alien tongues, and where coffee would cost as much as the shirts Madan usually wore. A radiant transformation just because the sun had set. The glow of the lamps could create this illusion that squalor was grace in a softer light. Then the stalls began the music, just one speaker but volume on full. Hindi film songs, as always, no matter that only half the population could speak the language, and that with difficulty. Spring has awakened with me. I seem to see its wonder with new eyes. A languorous rhythm, a voice clear like one's vision after the rains, and he remembered where he had heard the song before. Darjeeling. He and Prashant had been walking on the hill roads the last year of school, a clean summer evening. Prashant had been pensive, hesitant revelations about his homosexuality, which had for some reason impressed Agastya tremendously. Kanchenjunga, bright and two-dimensional, like a photograph, and a group of Tibetan girls had passed them by on nimble hill feet, softly singing this song, happy to be what they were, the offspring of aliens in an apathetic land. And Agastya was again overwhelmed by the conviction that there was a method in his past. Kanchenjunga in Darjeeling, and its photograph in Mariagar, Durga in Delhi, and Jagadamba in Madna. He would thus always try to organize his past, to force order into it, and it would continue to mock him with images of worlds lost and semblances of a pattern. A movement behind him on the veranda, making him start. The Averys. We just dozed off, said Sita with a laugh. Distinctly a post-coital laugh, thought Agastya, and again noticed how much easier it was to be in company, how in second his mind moved from the somber to the frivolous. The new song had a fast beat, happy and foot-tapping. There's no lover like me under the sky. I shall follow the sway of your hips to the horizon. He watched the Averys settle down in their chairs like dark shapes. Beneath the song, the evening was soothing, the creak of a passing bicycle, a distant jeep, muted conversation from the caretaker's house, somewhere laughter in the gaining gloom. It's so peaceful, isn't it? Said Sita suddenly. And so absolutely different. Agastya could sense her turning towards him. Didn't you find all this a little strange when you first arrived after Calcutta, I mean? Even though Calcutta is simply awful. Do you want to get into a Bengal versus the rest of India fight? Asked Agastya. Calcutta has soul even oozing out of its... He stopped before he could say tits, and then Avery startled him by speaking. He had expected him to continue to be silent and look mildly confused for the 2 remaining days. You're right, Sita. This place is not a bit like grandfather's letters. I didn't expect it to be really, but still, it's sort of surprising. Agastya tried to look solemn in the dark. With Sita, he could be flippant, more at ease, because they came from the same stock, megapolitan Indians who ate hamburgers and knew who Artu Datu was. But Avery was different, almost another species. They had nothing in common, not even a language, let alone the accent. Agastya remembered Sati many months ago in front of his easel saying that each language was a culture, and 2 generations ago an English collector and district magistrate had written letters home from an obscure town in India. And John Avery had read them 50 years later and heard stories about his grandfather, had met an Indian girl, and sensed a country through the books and films of other climes, and had been moved to take a passage only to be a little bewildered and perhaps feel a little foolish. But Agastya said nothing. The dark was dissolving Avery's stiffness, and Agastya sensed that a word from him could ruin the mood. My grandfather wrote home almost every day, said Avery. His letters are delightfully detailed. The district life, the club, whom he had met, who said what, all interspersed with things which now seem even historically significant. He wrote, for instance, in quite a few letters that all you're reading about in the newspapers about non-cooperation and the burning of English goods could be happening in some other country. Not a whisper of that in Madna. He wrote well. He liked this place and his work. He wrote his last letter from here, Jompana, from an inspection bungalow. But I can't place him here. Avery's arm drew designs in the dark. I can't relate this place to his letters. Your grandfather wrote of the Madna Club? Have you two been to it? Yes, said Avery, and all three began to laugh. It's such an instantly depressing place that it's quite interesting, said Sita. I think if my grandfather had been alive, she'd have wanted to come too. I think if my grandmother had been alive, she'd have wanted to come too, said Avery. Sita and I were coming to India anyway, to Bombay. Sita laughed unexpectedly. I think we should tell this young man, John. He won't be very shocked. She turned to Agastya. John and I aren't married yet, but are going to be soon. We went to Bombay so he could meet my parents and so that I could convince my mother that he wasn't what she calls a Pakibashar. She giggled adolescently. Then Madna was just a train away, so he wrote to the collector, and here we said we were married because that was much simpler. John was really born 2 generations too late. He would have fitted in so well in the Raj. I kept telling him Madna would be a waste of time, not at all like what he expected. Now he's regretting just everything. No, John? No, of course not, Avery mumbled. He was put off, perhaps by her frankness about themselves, but there was something else too. In the dark, Agastya could feel a tension between the two of them. Perhaps they had quarreled about something, or perhaps, and his stomach heaved with silent satirical laughter, India had got to them too. They could see him convulse. Hurriedly he asked, Why don't you tell me a little about yourselves? Where did you meet? A short silence. Then Sita said in a curiously defunct voice, the teasing and the laughter gone. In London. Where else? I'd gone to the London School of Economics for a PhD from Elphinstone. John was there too. Now he's joined the British Council. All that Agastya knew about the British Council was that in their early college years he and Madan had gleefully stolen books from its library. The caretaker crept up behind them and switched on the light. No, switch it off, said Agastya irritably. He did, and asked them whether they wanted anything, tea, perhaps. But the one flash of veranda light had befuddled them and ruined the intimacy. I want sugarcane juice, said Augustia. Will you two have tea? Sita also wanted sugarcane. Avery would have nothing. They talked on, Augustia and Sita desultorily, with Avery intermittently contributing a sentence, through the sugarcane juice and dinner, both of which were good. I'm glad you told him we were all vegetarians, said Avery. Another meal like that lunch and I'd have been dead. Augustia would have liked Avery to talk more, but didn't know how to get him to do so, and he wondered how Avery had survived the train from Bombay to Madna, on a train everyone wanted to know about everyone else. Perhaps Sita had parried the quarries while he had looked out of the window. Augustia's first night in Madna in another room. This one had no false ceiling. The caretaker cooked well. It wouldn't be so awful here, he thought, as a BDO. He remembered his very first evening in Madna, when he had been awed by the foulness of Vasant's cooking. Just simple good food could make one happy, he thought. How nice and animalish. Food had been one of the first shocks, then mosquitoes and the heat. It had been too tiring a day, perhaps, but that night he slept well. Early next morning, he and Avery with teacups on the veranda, looking out at the softened shabbiness of Jompana. In your grandfather's time, said Augustia, the forest would have been much, much closer. You cut the forest till you see red sand. Then you build on that red sand till you get a video parlor. Sita wasn't too well, Avery had said. She had suggested that they go on to Marihandi without her. She was down, Augustia presumed, or it was PMT. He remembered when Neera had first told him many years ago about premenstrual tension, how impressed he had been, in an obscure way, with womankind. Yes, I really wouldn't have imagined a video shop here, said Avery. The entire district is full of surprises, said Augustia. On my first day here, Kumar, that's the superintendent of police, invited me to see Amadeus and films like that on his video. Avery looked suitably surprised. But here in Jompana, of course. Augustia added, the more popular things would be Hindi films and secret screenings of something bluer. They looked out at the sugarcane stalls, strips of pilfered bamboo and teak, empty and squalid. It's amazing, said Avery again abruptly. A video here. Yes, it is. That Avery felt a kind of absurdity at the incongruities of Jompana faintly irritated him. About 65% of the population of the block of Jompana, a block is roughly 1/6 or 1/7 of a district, is illiterate. But one doesn't need to be brainy or literate to watch a blue film on video. Your real surprise is just the... He looked for the word. Juxtaposition, isn't it? And then he was galled by Avery's solemnity, and so began, in Madan's phrase, to finger him. But that's because India is a land of sublime and fascinating contradictions, where the Himalayas of the soul arise out of dung and dance hand in hand with the phallus of Shiv. Avery looked at him with a faint Srivastavian scowl. They left for the Marihandi soon after, Avery carrying a small, faded canvas bag. Sita came out to wave them off. See you this evening. An hour's drive to Marihandi, some of it on the rise. The forest was less desecrated but still unimpressive. Marihandi was just a village, naked children and dung smoke against the sky. The revenue circle inspector of the day before was on the veranda of the inspection bungalow, light blue shirt on a cream dhoti. The inspection bungalow was the late 1940s building. Nothing survives of my grandfather's time, I suppose, said Avery. The revenue circle inspector explained, standing while they sat on the veranda and had tea, and Augustia translated. The place where Richard Avery died was about an hour's walk away, Not a very difficult walk. It had in those days been a kind of watering hole for tigers. Now, of course, there were no tigers there, no water either. In some places, no trees. 50 years, said the inspector, is a very long time for a forest scape. But the place of the attack was marked by a memorial. They could perhaps look at that first, and then anything else that the sahibs might want to see. They left after tea, Agastya feeling futile. With them were the inspector and as a guide an adolescent tribal male, lean with the hip-swinging, vaguely erotic walk of one used to miles. Perhaps Avery sensed Agastya's mood, for he said, "I don't think we're going to see anything particularly exciting. Just a stone. But it would be like the end of a journey. Though you could say that that was at the Ross Cemetery in town on my first day here. Did you know it was called the Ross Cemetery? I asked about the Ross. No one seemed to know." They walked through a part of the village, dust that the rains would turn to mud, foreboding glimpses of the insides of hovels, a government fair price shop, everyone staring, some giggling, a few salaamed the inspector, some asked the guide questions that led to laughs, and the ubiquitous children followed them. The mid-autumn sun felt pleasantly warm on their shoulder blades. A few moments later, Agastya sensed that Avery had been talking to him and looked up from the rhythmic fascination of once white canvas shoes falling on light brown dust. Avery was gently sweating. "Why did you leave your sola topi behind?" asked Agastya. Avery smiled. "Perhaps a tiger would have got me too." They moved across the fields, the guide always having to slow down for the guided. "What have you and Sita been doing since you came to Madna?" asked Agastya, feeling vaguely guilty about his earlier inattention. "On the first day, apart from the cemetery, I looked through the records at the collectorate to try and get something on my grandfather. What I got most was another perspective, really. Then on the second day we went to Gorapak, Sita and I." Avery laughed suddenly. "My grandfather mentioned Gorapak quite often in his letters. If he wasn't coming to Jompana to hunt, he was going to Gorapak to relax. Relaxation watching those temple walls. But I liked my grandfather even more after I saw the place." They crossed fields of stubble, huge mango trees at the strategic points around them like giant chessmen at the end of a grueling game. A few 100 meters ahead, the beginning of a scrub that gradually became thin forest. The inspector turned to them. 6 years ago, all this could have been good forest, sir. Now, of course, no one comes here to hunt, and the animals are all gone. So I don't think anyone here would be able to point out the route the sahib's grandfather might have taken. And now the remaining forest has thinned considerably, and there are many tracks through it that the tribals of the surrounding villages used to reach Jompana. New tracks are being made almost every day. The sahib must not think that a track we will walk on could be one his grandfather might have used." Agastya translated. The inspector was 50ish and looked marooned with exertion. Poor man, thought Agastya. His immediate boss, the Tehsildar, would have left the success of the expedition to him, and so he had to sweat on meaningless jaunt. But there was no one to blame, least of all Avery and Shrivastav. One had been romantic and the other gracious. "On the first day we visited the club too," Avery smiled at Agastya. "Some club. In my grandfather's letters it was a place for family parties and dances and plays." He continued after a while. "At Gorapak I met some forest chap who knows you. Dubey. And suddenly Agastya remembered that 2 evenings ago he had promised Mohan that he would meet him before he left for Alwar, and Mohan must have waited all evening while he had been musing on a veranda in Jampana, and then he might have telephoned the Madna rest house to find that Agastya had left for Jampana without a word. He felt deeply ashamed of himself. He would leave behind a letter for Mohan with the foresters, and no excuses in it, just grovel. It's so good artistically one can't help feeling that it's not just smut. Sita had nothing to say on this, you know. She knows very little of the country outside Bombay, and Dubey was a little vague. He said that sex is part of the Hindu. Avery used his hands to express some philosophic, indefinable thing, and joy is part of the Hindu thought, and all that. You haven't been listening? Well, he just missed a chunk in the middle. I think that's a metaphysical gimmick to attract the foreign tourist. He laughed. No, you're not a typical one. No, I really don't know why there's so much sex in a Hindu temple, but great fun to watch. No, doubtless your grandfather would have agreed. Apart from this Hindu joy business, another theory is that the craftsmen were just sort of showing off their skill, and no one minded because they sculpted so well. No, as far as I know, there are no conclusive explanations for it. Into the forest, a young sal antique, bush and unspectacular shrub, clearings where the tribals had burnt down the trees to create a field, the sun's patterns on the tracks. They passed a group of tribal women, startled-eyed and black-bronzed. The guide moved on, untiring grace. Occasionally a bizarre rock formation or a patriarchal banyan, monstrous and ageless, 4 stories high and 5 houses wide. They changed tracks often, then the tribal stopped and pointed to a small stone on a few feet away from the track, in the shade between 2 trees. This is it, he explained. Gray-white stone as though it had been washed often, looking patient and pretty. In memory of Richard Avery, collector and district magistrate of Madna, 1917 to 1923, who was attacked here at this spot by a tiger on the night of 22 August 1923, and later succumbed to his injuries. He now lies buried in the Raw Cemetery in the town of Madna. A just and sympathetic administrator, he loved the land wherein he lived. May his soul rest in peace. This memorial stone erected by the civil administration of the district of Madna, 1923. Avery took out a camera and began clicking away. You're a hick tourist after all, said Agastya. What else did you think I could be carrying in this bag? Asked Avery as he moved to freeze with a click Agastya, the inspector, and the grinning tribal. Oh, lots of things. Anti-dysentery pills, anti-sunburn lotion, an inflatable sola hat, maybe a cricket bat, a cup of tea, a picture of the Queen, or maybe Diana. Avery laughed and continued to click away. Once I start, I can't stop. That's why I didn't take a single shot on the way. The orange sand of the track, a few trees, sal antique, a few yards away another ancient banyan, dead leaves, tree stumps, scrub, one luxuriant explosion of bamboo, a few tribals passing by, graceful and open-mouthed, the sky, the end of the road for 2 Averys. No chance of any tea here, no? Asked Agastya wistfully. No, sir, said the inspector firmly. We can rest here for a while, sir. Then on the way back a short detour, and we can see what was once the watering hole. Avery sat with his back against the stone. The sounds of different birds, shade and sun, wind and forest rustle. My grandfather was quite happy in Madna, said Avery to the sky. Agastya said, and now that you have seen the place, you wonder how. Avery laughed. He twisted to touch the stone, then he read aloud the inscription, half to himself. But in his letters I realize now, Despite all that detail, there's no sense of a living place. In fact, all that detail somehow further deadens it. There was apparently a big clock in the dining room, and most of his letters would begin, "It has just struck 4, and Baldev has brought in my tea. It is now 7:30, and Natwar, the one who can never get my boots right, is at the door asking about dinner." Everything is static, as though Richard Avery would always remain here in Madna, contented with his servants and the club and the hunting near Jompana and the relaxation at Gorapak, as though nothing would ever change. The letters are like photographs. That's really why I was so curious. More cautious revelation about grandfather and self, then the waterhole, an indistinguishable undulation, the walk back across the fields and through the village, now somnolent, tea at the inspection bungalow, expressions of gratitude to the inspector and the guide, met with genuine grins. "Should we tip?" whispered Avery. "Certainly not the inspector. He'd be very offended." "The boy, yes?" They woke up the driver and left for Jompana and reached there after 3. Sita was on the veranda with the Illustrated Weekly of India and tea. Avery enthusiastically described everything to her, and they decided to miss lunch altogether because it was too late. That evening, again on the veranda, Hindi film songs from the sugarcane stalls, lamps, and a romantic glow. Sita suddenly asked Agastya, "How's your wife now?" And he, after his sleep, feeling too relaxed, the rare jeep journey feeling, to wonder at the question or to lie, said, "I'm not married yet." Ahmed, deputy collector, direct recruit, had told them the story. He had been their guide to Gorapak. "An odd person," said Sita. "He always seemed to smile at his forearms when anyone else said anything. And when we were a little confused, he talked of you endlessly, and it seemed that your mother and your wife were both English. But your mother seemed to have died of cancer during childbirth, and she had simultaneously been a Goanese fisherman's daughter whom your father had torn away, to use Ahmed's phrases, from the bosom of her family. All that was clear was that she had been a Christian. That seemed to have impressed Ahmed a lot. Ahmed went up so many notches in Agastya's estimation. Sita said, "So I thought you were an Anglo-Indian, you know." She giggled in the gloom. "Whom in school we used to call Ding or Dingo. Bombay was full of them. And Calcutta, and Bangalore, and the schools of Darjeeling," said Agastya. "But not only Anglos. I think almost all Christians were called Dings. For many years I was called, among other things, half Ding and single Ding because of my mother. And amazingly enough, all the Anglos were very good at sports and simply nightmarish at studies. And the fairer they were, you know, the more sort of Caucasian looking, the more rapidly they went off to Australia. And the ones who looked sadly and unmistakably Indian, like my mother's cousins, became sadistic teachers of the junior classes in convent schools, hopelessly brainless but incredibly tough and mean." "Oh, yes, yes." Sita was laughing helplessly, head and cheek against the back of her chair, shaking. What Agastya had nudged in her was a common chord, a common memory, a cause of joy because it was shared. He again sensed that these two, an Avery and an Avery to be, much more than other couples, had pasts which the other could not grasp. But perhaps for them their pasts were not insignificant, and maybe just their London years could provide a sufficient stable foundation. They returned to Madna the next day, Agastya happy because he had again mangled a clandestine exercise in his room. They went to Shrivastav's house in the evening, Agastya to report and eat, Avery and Sita to say thank you and goodbye and also to eat. Shrivastav looked happy and was terribly inquisitive. Agastya answered more heroically than knowledgeably. "Did you see signs of drought there? Even though we had very good rains this year, Jompana block has always been prone to drought, you see. The catchment area is small and the water table low, So when you are BDO, you must be particularly careful about the scarcity of drinking water. To all of which Agastya answered, Sir, and remembering the food at Jompana said, yes, he would like to be a BDO there. They talked of the house itself, that it must have been like what it must have been like in Richard Avery's time, what from his letters his furniture had been like, which collector in which year had granted how many acres of the compound away to benefit what institution, of the Indian civil service and the Indian administrative service, and the difference between English and Indian members of the Indian civil service, and the exceptions to the norm, the Richard Averys and the Madhusudan Sens. Shrivastava, of course, talked the most, surprisingly. Avery was quite a close second. John and Sita were leaving early the next morning, by 5:40, train for Bombay. So, early farewells after a heavy dinner. Shrivastava said, Sen, will you wake up in time to see them off at the station? Don't say no. They are guests of the district. On the way out, on an impulse, Agastya stole his collector's car keys. Well, Shrivastava had been far too jolly all evening, and Mrs. Shrivastava had been wearing her black bra, and in the jeep all the way from Jompana he had thought of his Delhi visit, just 3 days old but light years in the past. Images ephemeral as coalescing mist. Drupa's mother kissing him on the cheek at Delhi airport, an old photograph that he had unearthed of Neera and he stoned in front of the Victoria Memorial. He had returned to his rest house room and his mirror had again been blurred by dust, and he had felt guilty, and reasonably, he thought, which had irritated him all the more, about Mohan. Avery had looked happy, mission accomplished. Sita had looked happy, she was going home, and the blackness had arisen out of the fathoms, and he had again wanted to dislodge the odor that surrounded his despair, that incapacitated him from action, but had not the solace of profundity. All evening companionship galled him, the conversation and laughter, the children. He had felt even more alone and had crawled into himself. The keys had been on a wooden tray on a side table. He had picked them up thinking, now there would be fruitless hunts and accusations of carelessness, and he would have ruined the evenness of at least one more life. Walking back to the circuit house with Avery and Sita, he laughed silently at the meanness of his actions. He laughed even more in the tube-light silence of his room. 5 keys. It sometimes felt so good to concentrate all one's faculties on acts without reason. Shrivastava would shriek at the driver and the servants, ignoring Mrs. Shrivastava's jibes that he had misplaced the keys himself. 1 key for the car, the 2nd for the petrol tank, perhaps a 3rd for the garage, then at least 2 keys, hopefully, to 2 steel almirahs that would contain everything important that the Shrivastavs could ever want. The duplicates to which Mrs. Shrivastava would have locked inside the almirahs themselves, and Shrivastava would shriek at this, his wife's senselessness. He got out of his clothes to the music of Keith Jarrett and lay down naked with the keys. The car keys were called Usha and Union. That amazed him for a moment, the possibility that someone somewhere in the country was being paid for thinking up names for car keys. And then he reasoned that this, like the Hindi radio news read at slow speed, was just one more act without explanation, and their bottom edges were irregular but graceful, ridged exactly like distant mountains. They looked smooth and worn. At least they had a purpose. Shrivastava would probably not have the duplicates with him, and the driver certainly wouldn't. They would probably be in the office. He laughed. He would be ably supported by the Chidambaram's incompetence in locating them. Well then, at least one day of acute discomfiture. He had been the last to move out of the drawing room. The children had left at 9, had either gone to bed or, he had thought, to examine each other's privates. And thus again that dark humor that did not ease, that he had shared only with a mirage, a looking-glass companion. Sita and Mrs. Shrivastava had smiled inanely at each other while waiting for Avery and Shrivastava to stop talking about the record room. He had again felt impotent with rage, and for not being master of his time, had wanted to explode. Now he picked up the keys and kissed them, his stomach convulsing as though vomiting out the laughter. An insane revenge, but fitting. The only answer to a world in which a bullock's tail could flake dung onto you if you weren't careful, in which a sulking district judge could ring you up to tell you that he was not inviting you to dinner, where you hungrily scoured the offices of subordinate district officials to coerce invitations to any meal, because you suspected that your cook might be feeding you his excrement. He laughed well into the night and slept heavily.